Good evening. Welcome to our Bible study tonight. Tonight I'm excited to share with you a new series that I'm going to be doing on some Old Testament characters in the Bible, and I want to tell you how I came about this. When I began, most of you know I didn't go into the seminary into ministry until I was 36. We moved down to Atlanta for me to attend the seminary. And at that time, my mother gave me my father's library. So I inherited all of my dad's books, several of which were Dr. Claypool's books, who was my mentor when I was in the seminary. And one of those books is called Glad Reunion. And there's so many people in the Old Testament that we know very little about. For instance, Enoch, we only have one sentence. We know that Enoch walked with God. But we do have many people in the Old Testament that we do get a lot of information about. And this is what makes the Bible so rich and is so trustworthy, is that we see these characters for everything, not these mythical characters where they seem superhuman, but real life folks that have flaws and go through struggles. And this is what we can relate to so well. So tonight I'm going to start a series, and we're going to start with the person of Abraham. This is one of the most important people in the Bible for many reasons, but it is, Abraham is the person that all Jews, all Muslims, and all Christians trace their heritage, their religious heritage through. So this is a very important person in the Bible, and he is someone that we can learn so much from. So I'm delighted tonight to share this Bible study with you about the person of Abraham. Well, this is really where our religious history begins, because in Genesis, God comes to Abraham for the first time, and he says, God himself encountered Abraham and made him a most extraordinary promise, a land to call his own, descendants more numerous than the sands of the sea. Remember, Abraham had no descendants, and this was very important to the Hebrew people. And so for God to come and offer not only for, to go on this journey with him, but for to have descendants and for all of them to be blessed had to be an extraordinary proposition for him. He says to receive all this, Abraham was asked to do only one thing: leave all that he knew, everything that he was familiar with. So here he is. He's not a young man, and he was obviously a successful man. He had lots of cattle and things that people at that time would show some level of success. And God asked him to leave all of these things. He says, to receive all this, Abraham was asked to do only one thing: leave where he was and set out on a journey with God. And God promised to direct him step by step. And what we see here is Abraham being willing to do this without a question or an argument. I mean, it was an incredible journey that he began with God. And he says there are three important things that we can learn from Abraham's journey with God. He says, the first thing I have learned from Abraham is that God's kind of security is dynamic, not static. It is a relationship with God is reflective of movement. It is never staying in the same place. In other words, there is not one place in the Bible where God comes to someone and says, I want you to just stay where you are and keep doing what you're doing. So we have to take note of that God is constantly asking us to change and to move, and that with the promise that he will help direct these changes. So it's very easy to get wrapped up in thinking that our lives are static, that they don't change, especially when we've had to be hunkered down and try to not leave the house and all these things that we're experiencing during this time. But life is not that way in this sense. We can look in the mirror each day and think that we're not changing very much, but we know when we look at those pictures year after year that we are. And so this is how God interacts with us, that it's an invitation to adventure and to promise. This movement is the essence of God's reality. One theologian describes that, so many of the pagan religions were about just trying to get, be safe in the midst of the chaos, just, get to a place where you can stay the same. And this is completely the opposite of that. God's kind of religion he describes as an exodus religion. It regards change and movement not as enemies to be resisted, but as ways God does his work and calls human beings to fulfillment. And you think about the whole thrust of the Old Testament was people trying to get to the promised land, something that was out there waiting on them, but they had to go on this journey in order to get there. So he says, when you stop and thinking about it, this is a seminal insight into the nature of existence itself. It affects the way one relates to that most basic of all realities, the reality of change. Because we know that the one thing that we can count on in life is change. It's going to come. We all know you don't have to have too many years behind you before you realize that that is an ongoing thing that we will deal with in life. So he says, what Abraham's experience teaches us is that such change is the way God does his work. It is not an obstacle to that. We've all heard this, the repetition of the words, the Lord will provide in the Bible, and to fear not. What is it that people are always fearing? They're fearing change. So he says, this really is the only kind of security that is possible in our kind of world, where nothing stays the same for long, not our bodies or our ideas or our families or anything. To see security in terms of permanence is folly. But to be told, as your days, so will your strength be. In other words, as you change, what you have to have will be provided. That is realistic. And Abraham's whole life is a confirmation of this truth. The second thing he says that he learned from Abraham is the theme of I never tire of emphasizing that perfection is not a prerequisite for God to begin work with somebody. What we see here at the very beginning of the history of faith is crucially important. God is willing to take us where we are and work patiently to move us along to where we need to be in the end. And this is one of those things where we see Abraham with some of his flaws. The story goes that a famine came and Abraham felt the need to go down to Egypt, and apparently Abraham's wife, Sarah, was a very beautiful woman. And Abraham feared that some person of power would come along and would kill him and take her. So he offers this proposition to her to tell people that she is his sister instead of his wife, and that possibility exists that she may even have to marry some powerful person in order for them to survive. And obviously that is a reflection of a very flawed individual who would have this kind of thinking in his mind. And he quotes this old black preacher where in a famous sermon where he describes this part of Abraham. He says, there were parts of him that had not yet heard the word. I love that. He says Abraham was capable of mistrust and fearfulness, just as capable of those things as he was a person of faith and courage. And several times we see these failings in him. But this is all about the process of the promise coming. So to me, it's another one of those points that can help us to trust what the Bible is telling us. It is so real to life. It is not it's not mythic. It's just true. These are people who had faults. He says, any way you look at it, this was a shabby, self-serving performance, and one which God himself had to step in and untangle. I mean, God had to actively get involved to get him out of this. He says, this is such a needed perspective for many of us, that perfection rightly belongs at the end of God's dealing with us and not at the beginning or in the middle of it. And in order to make this point, he quotes the verse in Matthew that all of us have heard many times. He uses the King James Version here, which I actually like. Be ye therefore perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. And he points out that in the Greek, it can be interpreted differently. In other words, it could also read, you shall be perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. In other words, by the time God is done with you and you go to be with God, you will be perfect then. But it is not a prerequisite now. And that's something that we can take great faith in. He says, the third thing I have gained from Abraham's story is that life is to be regarded as a gift. And in order to make this point, he recalls the very serious part of Abraham's life where he is called to take his son up on the mountain, and God is leading him to believe that he is going to have to sacrifice his son and give him back to God. And that is a very troubling story, but he handles this beautifully of the insight that he gets into this story. He says, God asking Abraham to sacrifice Isaac was not a regression into the kind of pagan beliefs in which Abraham had grown up in. It was God's way of finding out whether Abraham really had gotten the point after all of these years of living with the Lord's wonderful promise. The whole thing had started for Abraham just as his life had. It was something given to him without questioning of him deserve it. And God was putting Abraham to the test to see whether he understood all this or whether he had fallen into the notion that certain things were his right to possess and keep and preserve as he would. In other words, God gave him this gift of life in the beginning. He gave him all of these wonderful gifts along the way. And Isaac was one of those gifts that God had given him as well. He says, as you know, Abraham passed that test, and by his willingness to give everything back to the one who had given everything to him, he made clear that he did understand the most basic concept of all, that life in all of its manifestations is an unmerited gift. It is a gift. It is not something that we earned or deserved. It was simply a gift. So he says, what a difference such a perspective makes when it comes to the practical business of day-to-day living. It frees us from possessiveness and a sense of entitlement. It also enables us to receive the good things in our life with gratitude and to hold them lightly rather than clutchingly. It even opens the way to relinquishing beloved objects and persons without falling into bitterness and resentment. And then Dr. Claypool shares his most famous analogy. Dr. Claypool lost his little girl to leukemia when she was 9 years old. And you can imagine how devastating that would have been for him. And here he is, a very prominent preacher in the church at that time in the Southern Baptist Convention, which was on the right next to the campus at Southern Seminary. So you can imagine when he finally did come back into the pulpit after losing his little girl, everyone was very, very interested in what he had to say. And in order to make this point that life is a gift, that people are not our possessions, that they are God's gift to us, and we have to be grateful for the time that we did have and not bitter for the time that we don't, he used this analogy. He said that when he was growing up, they were very poor, and it was during World War II, and things were being rationed, and they were in a situation where they didn't have all the comforts that most people have. But it just so happened that their next door neighbors the man was called to the service, and he had to move away, and they asked to store their belongings in their basement. And among those belongings was a washing machine, an old green Bendix washing machine. And so these people were gone for 3 years, and it was Dr. Claypool's job when he was a boy to do the family laundry. And so he had this, they had this washing machine out on their front porch that he would use. And so this went on for 3 years. Well, eventually the man came back, but Dr. Claypool was at school that day, and he comes home, and all the basement had been cleared out, including that green Bendix washing machine. And he went running upstairs and said, "Someone has stolen all of our stuff." And his mom said, "No, they came back and they took the stuff that they had lended us." And he was upset that they no longer had this washing machine. So he says, "My mother sat me down and taught me a lesson that would surface in my mind 25 years later when I lost my little girl. She said, You have forgotten how the washing machine ever came to be. It never did belong to us. It was always a gracious gift. That we ever got to use it at all was great good fortune. She said to him, you relate to gifts differently than you relate to possessions. With gifts, you receive them gratefully and hold them lightly. And when they are taken away, you use that occasion to give thanks to God that they were ever given to us at all. And he talks about years later, in the depths of his grieving for his little girl, he remembered that story, and he came to the conclusion that the time that he had with her was infinitely more than he had ever deserved. He says, this revelation certainly did not make relinquishing my daughter easy or painless, but it did eliminate my occasion for resentment. It opened the possibility that the God who had given me the good old days could be trusted to give me good new days as well. And this is the whole perspective that came through the interaction of God with Abraham and his experience with Isaac. What he remembered on Mount Moriah, we would do well never to forget that life really is, at bottom, totally gift and grace. For those of us who got to know him personally, occasionally we would hear him say it this way, that life is gift and each breath is windfall. It's something we never deserved in the beginning, and this gift was given to us, and however long we get to stay here, each breath is a windfall. Before we conclude tonight, I also want to share with you something that Dr. Claypool would emphasize many times when people were going through tough times, that I just thought was so incredibly insightful. He called it the way of gratitude, this idea of always being grateful for the life that you have, regardless of circumstances, because it has always been a gift. And based on his experience with his little girl, he would say it this way. He would say, the way of gratitude does not ease the pain, but it does somehow put a light around the darkness. Now, almost always when I hear people talk that way, I almost have a sense of, that kind of, idealized way of talking. But this was someone who I knew so well, and knew his integrity so well, that I would always just sit and think about that. Here is a man who has lost his little girl, and he's sharing his insights, having gone through this grief with us. I mean, what could possibly be more painful than having to bury a child? And that is something that God never intended. But that insight gives us such hope that we can handle anything that life brings. The way of gratitude does not ease the pain, but it does somehow put a light around the darkness. I hope this has been helpful and insightful for you, and I so look forward to seeing you again soon. Go in peace.